Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Price. He is senior lecturer in psychology at Brunel University London. And today we're focusing mostly on the biocultural evolution of religio-spirituality and also the topic of universal Darwinism. We're going to get into that. So, Michael, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So perhaps tell us first, because you identify yourself as an evolutionary psychologist, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
And so as an evolutionary psychologist, how did you get interested in a topic like religio-spirituality? What got you there?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't my main topic originally. My main focus as a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara was more on the evolution of cooperation. But I've always been interested in sort of moral systems, the evolution of moral systems. And so sort of, yeah, I can't say exactly what led me to religion. And it was fairly, kind of a mid-career shift of focus a little bit. But I think I was getting just a little bit, ready for a new source of inspiration in my academic career. So, early on, I was just, on fire with enthusiasm for evolutionary psychology and moral psychology. And then I thought, like, well, maybe I've gone about as far as I can. And, the nice thing about being at a UK university, in contrast with some more high pressure US universities, is you do have a little more time and space to kind of explore new areas. And so for a while, I just sort of immersed myself in this new topic and how could I approach it in a way that it hadn't been approached before. Sort of what are the gaps in our evolutionary understanding of religion? And I started to think there were some pretty significant gaps and that I might have something to say about those. Then a few years ago, a good friend of mine and a close colleague, Dominic Johnson, University of Oxford, invited me to kind of co-lead this re-grant program on the evolution of science and religion as meaning-making systems, which enabled Dominic and I to pursue our own research, but also to distribute 8 or 17 re-grants to other researchers around the world. So I just got increasingly immersed in this topic to the point where now it's pretty much the center of gravity in terms of my research interests.
You mentioned the term meaning making there related to science and religion. What does meaning making mean in this context?
Well, I think it's simply, when the events and experiences that we encounter throughout our lives, how do we make sense of those? And how do we attribute sort of the significance of events? Is it so if you just want to sort of essentialize it, maybe from a scientific perspective, we try and say there's some kind of, physical explanation, some kind of causal explanation. And even if I'm not aware of what it is, it's sort of, we can break it down into materialistic terms. Whereas a religious perspective might be more oriented towards sort of some higher plan, some higher purpose that isn't necessarily something we can collect empirical evidence about, even in principle. So they're often contrasted, especially in the Western world. As opposite approaches, of ways of making sense of the world. Sort of you take sides, science versus religion. It's not really the way we're approaching it. I think the way we're approaching it is sort of these two alternate ways that people use for solving problems, specific sets of problems in their lives. So, yeah.
And what would be some of those problems? Because I was wondering here, when it comes to religion, I mean, we can get also into that specifically because I've also already had tons of interviews on the show with cognitive scientists of religion, for example. But when it comes to religion, the kinds of problems socially, morally, and others that it allows for us to solve, let's say, are more or less obvious. But when it comes to science, what are the kinds of problems that you are alluding to here?
Well, I think with science, it's pretty straightforward that, I mean, the scientific method is an approach to producing objective knowledge that
Yeah.
cannot be beat. I mean, I think it's really proved itself over the past as it's evolved culturally over the past centuries. Relatively new invention. I mean, compared to, so there are plenty of sort of pre-scientific societies, but there are no like societies we would consider pre-religious. So science is really, pretty. It's pretty straightforward. It can be interpreted as an invention that humans have created for the generation of objective knowledge. And then and that that utility can be applied to basically an infinite number of problems we might face, right? That
Mhm.
in trying to control our environments and lives. Uh, Whereas with religion, so there's different approaches as soon as you talk about problem solving and you're talking about evolution, you're talking about adaptations, because adaptations are problem solving devices. Like a biological genetically encoded adaptation has been selected by evolution because it's particularly good at solving some adaptive problem related to, i.e., related to survival and reproduction, or set of adaptive problems. So when people talk about the evolution of religion, often, I think you may have been alluding to this a little bit before, they often talk about cooperation and social coordination
Mhm.
and almost like a cultural group level problems. And they say it
Yeah.
not so much psychological religiosity, but religion as a cultural attribute. We've tended to approach it, religiosity, as a psychological and individual level approach to interpreting events and experiences in your life, so that it's a kind of bias that allows you to interpret these events in a way that solves problems for you. And the kinds of problems we focused on are problems related to essentially uh, finding a source of motivation in the face of adversity.
Mhm.
So a source of especially like optimism and sense of purpose. And these are mo widely regarded but in psychology as sort of motivational systems or motivational mechanisms
Mhm.
that keep you motivated to persist in trying to strive for adaptive goals. So the kinds of problems that we focused on, Dom and myself, um, have been those kinds of problems related to motivation,
Mhm.
and solving adaptive problems. And when we say in the face of adversity, we don't just mean, say, you're starving to death or you're, like a real existential crisis or
Mhm.
something, but everyday adversity. I mean, every day we face, problems about, being motivated, and sort of persisting in your goals, and not being too depressed to sort of carry on and that kind of thing.
And when it comes to science specifically, do you think that the sort of adaptationist perspective that you can apply to religion, you can also apply to science? Because I was just thinking that perhaps the kinds of cognitive frameworks that we bring into science, theoretical perspectives, the way we approach knowledge production, tend to be very counterintuitive. So would that also have to do with adaptationism in any way? I mean, do we have any sort of evolved adaptations that predispose us in any way to doing science, or is that sort of I don't know if we could call it a secondary trait that is more the result of cultural evolution or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly have kind of adaptation, proto scientific predispositions, where certainly, human ancestors, in the environments in which we evolved, were doing something like science when they were through trial and error discovered a way to make a better, arrow point or tool of some kind, or
Mhm.
way of forging, whatever. So I think, yeah, we have the ways of sort of acquiring knowledge for sure, and having expectations about what might work, and then having those falsified, and
Mhm.
then so moving on. So yeah, I think there's this rudimentary. Certainly, we have the sort of adaptive machinery in place, and then, like you say, I think the scientific method, in a formal sense, is simply the cultural elaboration or almost
Mhm.
amplification, and formalizing those processes and saying, here's what really works, and here's, yeah, we have these adaptations for generating and acquiring knowledge, but we also have adaptations that make us often very bad at discerning the empirical truth, because we're such biased creatures, and we have our own subjective interests, and we have our own, often, interest in lying, or
Yeah.
misrepresenting the truth, or for whatever reason. We have all kinds of inbuilt biases that we really need to, often it's an uphill battle to overcome those. So with a formal scientific method that says, here you have this hypothesis and you try and falsify it, and, it's essential for keeping us sort of on the straight and narrow when it comes to the production of objective knowledge. Um, Now, so what was the rest of your question there?
I mean, basically, just to reformulate some of what I said, I was trying to remember the exact terms that people like, for example, David Segiri use in their work, because he has two very interesting terms when he mentions basically core knowledge, that is intuitive biology, intuitive physics, and
Hmm.
intuitive psychology, or
Right.
folk psychology, biology, and physics, because that's what we are intuitively predisposed to, thinking about things in the world, about other people, about other animals and plants and so on.
Yeah.
But then and that would connect in a way, at least according to the work of some people out there, that would connect to religion directly. But then when it comes to science, there's perhaps one further step that we need to take, because the way we understand, for example, physics scientifically, biology scientifically, psychology scientifically, I mean, in many ways, is very counterintuitive and detached from that sort of core knowledge
Oh,
that
yeah.
right. So that was something I was trying to allude to.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess I would say I would characterize scientific method or science as a cultural adaptation.
Mhm.
But it's also a byproduct of pre-existing adaptations that we can use, um, often effectively, without, in the absence of a formal scientific method, often effectively, to generate knowledge.
Mhm.
Um, but we've also found that if we really formalize that process and we just forget about our subjective biases, we have a theory, we have predictions that would either falsify or support the theory. Once we formalize that method, then we were able to make all kinds of crazy discoveries that turn out to be true in the
Yeah.
scientific sense, but that are entirely counterintuitive, right? About like particle physics, and how a particle can, until it contacts another particle, or another system, it has a superposition where it's in all everywhere at once, or particles that can tunnel through solid matter, things that aren't just counterintuitive to us, but they seem impossible. Like any right thinking rational person is going to say that's impossible. That's so the scientific method has taken us, building on these adaptations that were much more intuitive. I think it's taken us far beyond, the limits of our intuition, and of our, we're evolved to deal with a universe at the scale that we
Mhm.
live in, not at the scale of atomic physics. So um, I think that, yeah, the scientific method has it's kind of everything is the result
Mhm.
of adaptations. You have to start with
Yeah.
adaptive psychology, but it could be seen of as a byproduct and elaboration of those adaptations that has then allowed us to sort of travel far beyond their limitations.
Mhm.
Um, and just with religion, I think it's potentially a similar thing, but it's just dealing with a different set of problems.
Yeah.
that are very important to people. I mean, there are people have interests beyond just generating objective knowledge, and people have an interest in issues for which there is no empirically right or wrong answer. So, for example, we're talking about optimism a lot in our studies, and whether you're optimistic about the future or not, there's no right or wrong answer about, you know, should you be optimistic or not, because it's an expectation about the future. There's no way of answering whether you're right or wrong until the future. So there's no real truth value assigned to optimism. Nevertheless, optimism is associated with all kinds of survival benefits, and uh, it's associated with more successful and goal striving, goal achievement, etc. So it has certainly really tangible, important repercussions for survival and reproduction, but it has nothing to do with whether you're objectively right or wrong. Like a lot of our biases, I mean, they're often wrong. In fact, like evidence suggests that human nature does have this optimism bias that is, in sort of psychologically healthy people, it's biased towards being over optimistic, but that seems to be a bias that has been adaptively functional in our ancestral past.
Yeah, I mean, just to be fair here, in religion, there's also some things, not many, but some things that are also at least slightly counterintuitive, like what people refer to when they use the term minimally counterintuitive ideas in the cognitive science of religion, like, I don't know, Jesus walking on water, or some of the miracles that he supposedly performed that are described in the Bible. I mean, beings that are part human beings, part other animals and stuff like that, just because
Yeah,
apparently it is, when it comes to the ways our memory works, it becomes more salient to have those ideas. Right.
absolutely. Yeah, those ideas. Pascal Boyer is really brilliant researcher. Talks about, and others talk about minimally counterintuitive ideas, and for sure, like just like science has made the seemingly impossible, has shown us that it's true somehow, and in ways that we can't intuitively grasp, but nevertheless it's enabled all kinds of technological advances. So religion also talks about impossible. We're using Christianity as an example here, but all kinds of things that we normally regard as impossible, virgin birth and resurrection, etc., the things you mentioned. And I think in the case of religion, it's often, I see that as kind of different, because it's more, I see those as costly signals of your religious devotion. So if you're willing to suspend disbelief to the point where you believe in things that are in any other context would be seen as impossible, well, that's a sign of your unquestioning devotion. And I guess I'd step back too and say, often when you talk about when you tell people you're studying religion or spirituality, they immediately think of something like, oh, you mean like the Catholic Church, or they think some specific cultural manifestation or set of beliefs. And what we're actually trying to get at is none of that. We're trying to get right to the core. And the reason I've used this term sometimes, religio-spirituality, is because we're looking at a level of resolution to where those concepts are indistinguishable: religiosity, spirituality. So at a higher level, usually religion refers to sort of organized religions, like being a member of an institutionalized church or something. Whereas spirituality can be more sort of individualistic, or much more like you're not necessarily affiliated with an organized way of understanding the universe in that way. But what we're trying to get at really is, what is the cognitive core of when people talk about religiosity and spirituality, what do they essentially mean cognitively? So when we strip away all the cultural layers, we're really trying to get at just the cognitive essence of religiosity. Yeah.
And How does the cultural aspect get into the picture here when it comes to religio-spirituality? Because, of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, you approach things here through a biocultural evolutionary perspective and not just, let's say, an evolutionary psychological perspective or a biological evolutionary perspective. So, how does the culture get into the picture here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, my background in evolutionary psychology means that I was, my PhD advisors were Tuvia and Cosmides, who are sort of founders of this modern field of evolutionary psychology, which they would
Yeah.
define sort of the UCSB way is of defining it is looking at what would be genetically encoded cognitive information processing mechanisms that are it's trying to arrive at a very precise definition of human nature as and the brain mind is a bundle of these adaptations. So they're talking very much about sort of the genetically encoded, psychological mechanisms. And so I think initially when I was trying to look at religion, I am of the, that's my preferred approach too. But I started to realize that there is a lot of significant cross cultural variation in how religious um, these religious sorry, I would say ways of looking at the world are expressed. And I didn't want to have to be in the position of where I was claiming that what we're saying could be an adaptive function of religiosity is necessarily you're necessarily going to find in, say, hunter-gatherer societies all over the
Mhm.
world, mainly because the data we've been collecting hasn't been from hunter-gatherer societies. So I wanted to be a bit more agnostic about whether this is, the extent to which these are just sort of raw psychological adaptations expressing themselves in the same way around the world and in all types of societies versus, again, they could be elaborated culturally in different ways, and some cultural manifestations of these sort of underlying adaptations for religiosity. Some of them might be more effective than others at
Mhm.
solving the problems or sort of satisfying the motives that these adaptations ancestrally satisfied for people.
Mhm.
So I use the term biocultural. I guess maybe an analogy would be helpful. So if you think about, so sometimes people think about, okay, there's biological evolution, there's cultural evolution, and these things are sort of, you have to take a side, and they're alternative types of
Yeah.
explanations. And partly that's, I think, political because you have, people where their preferred approaches competing for journal pages with other people they see as a different faction, and so I don't buy into any of that. Actually, I think the kinds of behaviors you'd expect to evolve are the ones that are going to be most consistent with both, with biological evolution and also cultural evolution. And I see like cultural behavior and cultural evolution again as an elaboration or exaggeration and amplification of underlying psychological adaptations. So if you think about a candy like Skittles, these little like fruit flavored candies that are kind of like fruit, except every aspect of fruit that appeals to our evolved psychology is just turned up to 11, so really like the really sweet or really sour or really tangy, and the colors are just they're really bright, and it's sort of pushing all those buttons that makes a fruit appealing to our evolved psychology and just kind of ramping them up. And so much of culture is like that. It's
Mhm.
not sort of overriding our evolved psychology. It's actually allowing us, it's an expression of it, and often kind of an exaggeration of it.
Mhm.
So that's why I call it biocultural, is because I think certainly at root, you're working with, we're working with these evolved adaptations. But then different cultural forms, different cultural manifestations might have elaborated on those in different ways. So maybe monotheism, for example, is a particularly effective way at solving some of these problems that these adaptations originally evolved to solve. Or maybe it's not. I mean, maybe a more like less agentic view of God, like Buddhism, say, is more effective. So I want to leave that room for cultural differences, partly because they obviously exist, and you don't want to deny something that's obviously true.
And from an evolutionary perspective, what would you say are perhaps some of the main benefits of religion, particularly the ones that have fitness payoffs?
Yeah. Well, to answer that, just to give you a little bit of you probably already have a good understanding of this, but maybe for listeners, in evolutionary approaches to religion, this is a bit of a oversimplification, but they've tended to fall in two camps. And one camp, and probably I would say like the predominant one has seen explains religiosity as a byproduct of adaptations for social cognition, like theory of mind, our abilities to read minds of other people, other animals, agency detection. So these mechanisms associated with social cognition are sort of one way to think about it is we just turn them towards the universe at large. And so a way to think about God is simply we take our theory of mind, attributing intentions and agency and emotions to other people, and we just sort of turn it towards the universe at large. It's what Jesse Bering has called the existential theory of mind. And so a lot of like Pascal Boyer and others, Justin Barrett, see religious thinking as a byproduct of adaptations for social cognition. And then there's another camp that says, well, they think there's probably some adaptive aspects to religious thinking, and these tend to have to do with cooperation, social coordination, and broadly cooperation. And that can be cooperation at the level of the individual, like my colleague Dominic Johnson has written a book about God is watching you, about how religious ideas about punitive deities sort of make us allow us to cooperate more adaptively. Or the idea that whole cultures benefit from religious belief systems that enhance cooperation and coordination within groups that then allow them to spread via conquest but because they're imitated by other groups, to give them some political advantage. So it's sort of like you choose if you want to go to the sort of adaptation, you say it's cooperation, or otherwise you say it's a byproduct. And our approach has been to sort of say there's this whole other huge literature on the relationship between religiosity and health, basically physical and mental health. And most of this research is not explicitly evolutionary. It hasn't been sort of evolutionary. So it's a little bit strange because it's a fairly well documented positive relationship between religiosity and physical and mental health. Mostly it's conducted in Western societies, but still it's sort of an obvious, it raises the question of, well, could this be relevant to an evolutionary understanding if there are these connections to health and survival? I mean, literally survival and longevity. And so that is the approach we've been taking more, is looking at how from an evolutionary perspective can we try and explain this relationship, and also like what are the mediating psychological variables that could help explain sort of religious thinking. Then that leads to in better physical and mental health, what is sometimes just referred to as well-being. And so I mean that's been, I think, the main difference in our approach is we're trying to come up with a more satisfying evolutionary explanation that doesn't leave out this kind of potentially quite important part of the explanation, and then also integrates these sort of non-evolutionary approaches with these evolutionary approaches, which for whatever reason have tended to focus on cooperation and then the byproduct idea.
So I want to connect or try to connect all of this to an idea that you proposed in your work that you called Universal Darwinism. But just before we get into that, since we've already talked here about the main benefits of religion and also how it has some fitness payoffs, do you think that by studying religion or religio-spirituality from an evolutionary perspective and really getting a better understanding of uh, the benefits we get from it and how we get them, we could apply these to secular societies and get the same sorts of individual and social benefits uh, without the religious aspect to them, or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that okay, so this is also sort of more about the state of the field, but
Mhm,
most social scientists, usually not coming from an explicitly evolutionary perspective, when they've tried to explain this positive relationship between religiosity and health, it's usually in terms of social support.
mhm,
Um, so religious people, like if they are members of congregations or whatever, they tend to have these religious communities that are good sources of social support. And we know that social support is good for your health. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be religious. So there's nothing unique about religion in this regard in terms of explaining its relationship with health. It's simply a good it gives people access to a community of social support.
yeah.
Um, and if that were true, then I would say the answer to your question about could we have a secular society that sort of solved all those problems without sort of veering into this religiosity worldview, I would say yeah, as long as we can give people access to that kind of social support. Um, and yeah, that was an approach I was taking a few years ago, and I published a study on that and looking at secular congregations, particularly the Sunday Assembly, which is kind of they don't call themselves this, but probably the most easiest way to explain it is like an atheist church
Mhm,
that started here in London that kind of spread all over the world. Um, so I think that, and I do think that is part of the explanation for why religion has positive associations with health is social support. But I think there's a lot more to it. I think there are things that are unique about religious, not behavior like social behavior, but religious belief per se,
mhm.
that I think would be considered pretty uniquely religious. Um, and I'm not trying to be cagey about this. I'll just say like what we think it is this belief that there's a higher plan, that one's life is following a higher plan. So a plan that has been uh, created by some kind of higher power or powers. And we've tried to define it in a way that is universal. So we're
Mhm.
talking about, at least for all major world religions, we needed a definition that would apply equally well to say monotheistic Abrahamic religions or Buddhism or Hinduism, or indeed sort of informal spirituality, where you people say, even like reading your horoscope, or saying like, oh, the universe is trying to tell me something. I'm looking for a sign in a kind of informal spiritual way. Um, so we're trying to come up with a definition of religiosity slash spirituality that would apply across religions. And what we landed on was this sort of belief in a higher plan, because that is, and we've done a lot of research since then that supports this idea that um, it is a it's very hard to define sort of religiosity or religious belief. I mean, people think it sounds easy, but then you realize, what are you actually talking about? So we were just focusing on what is the cognitively, what do all of these things we call religion, what do they have in common as an essential belief that makes them unique? And I think it would be this belief in a higher plan, that your life is following this plan that is, and it's invariably it's a benevolent plan, at least benevolent with respect to you yourself and your own welfare, not
Yeah.
necessarily with respect to everybody else. They might die in the apocalypse, but you're going to be okay. So it has to do with this idea that this plan is has been devised by some kind of higher power or powers, not necessarily a god, but some kind of power, and it's ultimately consistent with your long-term welfare.
Mhm.
Okay, so that serves as that. Well, first of all, that's a uniquely religious idea. I don't know of any sort of scientific ideas that, I mean, you can, I know of some sort of theoretical ones that we don't have yet have this sort of a technology to test. We don't have the ability to, uh, you know, produce empirical evidence one way or the other. So I think there are scientific ideas for how that could happen in theory, but they're not widely accepted. Hardly any, nobody really believes them, and any to the extent that they believe in
Mhm.
religious beliefs. So that is what I think is probably the unique aspect of what we call religion, spirituality, cross culturally, that sets it apart and that makes it uniquely useful to people as a kind of repository or a foundation for optimism and sense of purpose, because it really can. People do find it useful for amplifying, especially in times of where you might be tempted to give up, sort of throw in the towel, because you don't think you're going to succeed. If people can sort of say, no, there's this is part of a higher plan, and I have this is not just my purpose, this is a purpose shared with this higher power. I think that can make people more resilient and more persistent and in the pursuit of goals, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, uh, whereby just the fact that you don't give up and that you're striving for these goals more intensely, it's that motivation itself
Mhm.
makes you more likely to achieve the goal.
Right. So tell us now about this idea of universal Darwinism. What do you mean by it, basically?
Yeah, I mean, so a few years ago when I was sort of looking for new sources of inspiration, well, years ago I read this book called The Life of the Cosmos by a physicist
Mhm.
named Lee Smolin, that talks about um, the multiverse and how the types of universes that are going to be most common in the multiverse are going to be those that reproduce most prolifically and successfully, and talks about black holes as basically the reproductive system of the universe. So
Yeah.
that's one way of thinking about universal Darwinism. Is it's the basic ideas of just, the the uh, the kind of orderly forms that exist in the universe around us are those which have almost well, pretty much by definition, um, found ways to combat the second law of thermodynamics. The tendency towards of isolated systems towards increased entropy, increased disorder,
Mhm.
and so the kinds of orderly systems we observe all around us are all examples of systems that have temporarily at least found ways to kind of circumvent the second law of thermodynamics. That's basically what universal Darwinism is. It's sort of saying that the principles, or the processes that we can observe in biological evolution in a more abstract way are operating. The universe is basically saturated. The multiverse is saturated with these same kind of processes. And really what it's about is second law of thermodynamics. Okay, so this increased sort of relentless march towards entropy,
Mhm.
and then processes that have of order, sometimes complex order, that have found ways to subvert this law. Um, and the kind of supreme example of uh, complex organization is life, and
Mhm.
adaptations, and then the organisms that are composed of these adaptations, that are bundles of these adaptations. These are the least entropic. I mean, Lee Smolin himself says this in his book, that these are the least entropic entities in the universe. And there's a formal definition for that, just meaning like if you swapped out, say, cells from one part of your
Mhm.
body, say your liver, and you exchange it with neurons, you're going to start to interfere with the ability of that system to exist. You're going to hasten its path, down towards entropy. And so, by that definition, like living organisms are the most sort of the least entropic systems that we know of. So I think it's helpful in understanding adaptation and in understanding why adaptation is so important, and understanding that complex organizational complexity is the hallmark of selection.
Yeah.
So basically, you have second law of thermodynamics. Then you have kinds of selective processes that this destructive process that creates entropy is simultaneously responsible for creating the order, because it's like everything that can slips through its net becomes examples of orderly systems. And yeah, I felt and it really just sort of relates to our understanding of the universe in a very deep level. So I gotta give credit to a friend of mine named John Campbell, who was an independent scholar, who I kind of stumbled across, who wrote some really excellent books. Darwin Does Physics, and some other books. And he passed away a couple of years ago, but I thought he just had some really brilliant ideas that influenced me a lot. And we published together. And one of his kind of anecdotes that really I thought was really the most compelling was talking about sort of the founder of information theory, Claude Shannon. And in the 40s, when he was coming up with information theory, he was trying to define information and knowledge mathematically. And then sort of the opposite of it is what he called ignorance. And he was asking von Neumann, the famous mathematician, when he showed him his mathematical formula for ignorance, and he wasn't sure whether he should call it ignorance, what he should call it. And von Neumann said, we'll just call it entropy because it's mathematically equivalent to entropy. And so this mathematical equivalence of knowledge and information with entropy, and then by the same token, with ignorance, the absence of knowledge, ignorance is equivalent to entropy. And by the same token, adaptation is equivalent to knowledge. It's sort of, it's knowledge about what it takes to persist in one's environment.
But do you think that this idea of universal Darwinism and life and Darwinian selection as a sort of anti-entropic process would have implications beyond science? I mean, as to how we think about existence and life more specifically, do you think that it would have potentially, I don't know, existential implications or not?
I mean, I think absolutely, like down the road. I mean, I see no limitations on what, as long as we can avoid extinction as a species, I think human knowledge is just gonna, so I'm not gonna, think anything's off the table in terms of how we could use this understanding to answer sort of existential questions that we're presently just incapable of understanding. But I also acknowledge that there's a lot that we are incapable of understanding. I think where it's become useful for me in the study of religion is in thinking about ideas about function. So adaptations have functions, and their function is to basically withstand the second law of thermodynamics, is to withstand the forces of entropy. And then thinking about sort of Lee Smollen's idea about function at this higher level, right? At this multiverse level, with black holes have this function of allowing universes to reproduce. And then it just occurring to me increasingly that it seemed increasingly like that was what we call religious thinking, that's what it's doing. It's taking this idea of function or purpose, and just applying it to a level higher and saying, it's not just, obviously organisms have purposes, they're hungry and they want to eat or whatever. But what if our universe has a purpose? Or what if not just my life, I don't just have purposes in my own life. What if life itself, like the evolutionary process, has some higher purpose? And it first of all, it made me think that's sort of what that's essentially, I think, what religion is doing. It's moving that level of evolved purpose or function just up a level to a
Mhm.
level we don't have access to for the by and large, in terms of collecting empirical data, which I think takes it out of the realm of scientific knowledge. So it's not a competing way of. I don't see it as a competing way of understanding the world. It's a way of understanding the world for like questions that we don't have the ability to answer empirically, but they're still very important to us. Um, and for me, so I think just thinking about this um, purpose at this higher level helped me arrive at this definition of religiosity spirituality. Is like that's a pretty good working definition of religion psychologically. It's this idea of purpose at a higher level.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think it has some kind of limited utility in that regard for now. I think just because we don't have the ability to test these ideas right now, the practical scientific utility is limited
So
for the
let
time
me
being.
ask you about one last topic slash question, because there's at least one more domain that religion usually deals with that from a more scientific perspective, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated to really make a move from describing what the world is or what the world looks like, going from that to what we should do, what we ought to do. That is the more moral domain, going from the descriptive to the prescriptive. But do you think that
Mm.
from an evolutionary perspective, there's, I mean, that we could derive moral principles from this kind of view in science? I mean, is there, for example, since from an evolutionary perspective, at the end of the day, it all boils down to our ability to reproduce or not reproduce, I mean, to our fitness. Do you think that there's, for example, any moral obligation for us to reproduce and to promote future human evolution, or not?
Well, I mean, the short answer, if you're talking about can evolutionary knowledge or scientific knowledge tell us what our morals should be, I'd say no.
Mhm.
Pretty unequivocally, no. I think that's a road that it's for sure a double-edged sword. And I also just don't think I can't see how it could really be true. I mean, I think it can tell us, why we might be interested in engaging the behaviors that were associated with reproduction and survival in the past, but it can't tell us anything about sort of what's right or wrong. I think certainly not. Sometimes people have, I think, abused evolutionary knowledge, saying this or that is natural or unnatural. And to me, that distinction makes no sense. First of all, because what if it's not natural, then what is it? I mean, that implies there's something else, like there's some supernatural realm, and I just think that's so. Short answer is I do not think I believe that the naturalistic fallacy is in fact a fallacy, and
Mhm.
I certainly don't look to. I do think this idea is very hard. It's very hard to like excise it from people's understanding, and there's a tendency of humans to want to do that, and to say that to think that if you're calling something into adaptation, that somehow elevates it morally,
Mhm.
which I think is really closer to being wrong than right, because so many of our most valued cultural creations are byproducts of adaptations, and to say something is a byproduct is in no way to sort of demote it and say it's less natural. I mean, mathematics and so much of our art and culture and technology and transportation, all of these things that make our lives, well, I think on balance, probably, well, at least we try and use them to make our lives more enjoyable and livable. And they're all byproducts, and that doesn't mean they're immoral. So the short answer is no. I don't think you can derive morality from evolution any more than you can from geology or chemistry. Or I think it's just a way of again, generating objective knowledge about human nature.
Mhm.
It, and just, I thought you might be asking, what about the connection between religion and morality? And I don't think there's any necessary connection there either. I mean,
Okay.
actually, when you talk about, when we sort of retrospectively label what we call in hunter-gatherer societies, we call it religious beliefs, religious behavior. Of course, to them, it's just the way they see the world. They don't distinguish. They don't call it religion. They just think this is the way the world we think the world is. But oftentimes it has no explicit ties to morality.
Yeah.
And this connection with morality, I think, is more of a culturally evolved thing,
Mhm.
which kind of makes sense because religion and culturally has become such a powerful kind of social force that if people have a moral agenda, they're going to want to tie it into
Mm.
religion just to sort of reinforce it. But I don't think there's any necessary connection. Again, I think the sort of the essence of religiosity is just simply this belief in a higher plan. And I think Steven Pinker, was it? Well, they called it kind of it's like a dust bunny, like an intellectual dust bunny. I'm not
Mhm.
sure if he was talking about religion this way, but it sort of collects all this baggage, like morality and people's ideas about sin and what's right and wrong, and really in essence, it's not about that. It's just about believing that there's a higher plan and your life is somehow following this higher plan.
Great. So before we go, would you like to tell the audience what are the kinds of work you're doing at the moment, what you're going to be working on in the near future, and does it have anything to do with religio-spirituality, or are you moving on to other sorts of topics?
It does have to do with religio spirituality, and I'll just call it religiosity, but
Yeah.
uh, and so yeah, for the past few years, Dominic Johnson and I have been co-leading a project funded by Templeton Religion Trust and the Issachar Fund, called The Evolution of Science and Religion as Meaning Making Systems. So it's mainly a re-granting program. We've funded other projects looking at religion and science, and we've also been conducting our own research. Um, and as far as our own research goes, the main focus has been, well, we've completed a big cross-cultural study. So all major religions, 54 countries, 39 languages, 6 continents. So a truly cross-cultural study, over 55,000 participants. Um, and we've tried to define religion, come up with a way of defining religiosity
Yeah.
psychologically in a way that would work cross culturally. So that's where that sort of belief in a higher plan measure that we devised, that's where it came from. And then trying to test it against these alternative hypotheses about um, whether belief in a higher plan, this construct that we've devised, whether it's a better predictor of optimism and sense of purpose, or what we call these sort of motivating outlooks, these motivational mechanisms, whether it's a better predictor of those compared to religious social support, which is, as I mentioned, is kind of a pretty probably the conventional wisdom about the link between religiosity and well-being. And then also there's been some other ideas about, well, maybe the links between religious belief and well-being have more to do with this, just a belief system in general and not a religious one per se. And so
Mhm.
some very interesting work suggesting that belief in science and what's called like scientific faith could produce the same sorts of positive outcomes with well-being. So we also tested that. We looked at sort of scientific belief and compared it, and looking at a sort of multi-level regression models that allow us to partial out the variance in well-being that's explained by belief in a higher plan versus religious social support versus scientific belief. And we've started publishing those results, and we are on the verge of publishing the rest, but have basically found that there's pretty cross-culturally support for the belief in the higher plan tends to be stronger and more consistent than for either of those alternative hypotheses. But that's not to sort of throw shade on those alternatives, because I think they're good, they're plausible. We wanted to test them because we thought they were good ideas and they were plausible ideas, not because we wanted to, have straw men. So actually, the evidence that we found cross-culturally supports all three of those hypotheses, or those approaches. But I mean, the belief in a higher plan did tend to get more consistent and I'd say stronger support overall.
Great. And if people are interested, where can they find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the religion work has been sort of we've been sort of working on it for years, and now we're ready to publish. And so we have a paper. Well, we have a special issue. Dominic Johnson and I are co-editing a special issue of the journal Religion, Brain, and Behavior. We're going to have an article on that, and that'll be forthcoming in a few months. I'm not exactly sure when, but it's also going to have about, I think, 8 other articles by some of our re-grantees who are also doing research on the same program. And then hopefully within a few months, we're going to publish our sort of flagship study from our flagship manuscript based on this cross-cultural study that is where we're comparing belief in a higher plan to religious social support and belief in science. But the one coming out in Religion, Brain, and Behavior takes a different angle. It looks at the extent to which religious belief and scientific belief are seen as compatible or not in different regions of the world. And so we're very used to thinking of them as incompatible in Western societies, and they are. I mean, people, in the sense that the more you believe in belief in a higher plan, the less the lower is your scientific faith. But it's not true in outside of sort of North and South American, sort of historically Christian societies and European societies. It's not the case in Africa and Asia, especially Hinduism. They're actually positively correlated. So faith in science and belief in a higher plan. So, and we found that the extent to which the more compatible these two belief systems are, the more each belief system is respectively independently associated with well-being. So, in other words, in cultures where they're seen as more compatible, the associations with belief in a higher plan and well-being and the associations with belief in science and well-being are both stronger. So they're kind of seem to be operating synergistically, as opposed to, so if you could somehow, hit upon a belief system that allows you to kind of extract the best of both, so it allows you to kind of have religious beliefs but that don't conflict with or undermine belief in science, right. But still allow you to kind of have the benefits in terms of the optimism and sense of purpose without forfeiting scientific knowledge. That really could be the best of both worlds. And we're not prescribing anything. We're not saying, of course, we're not saying anybody should go out and join a religion or anything like that. We're just reporting these results that there does seem to be some benefits to well-being from both kinds of belief systems that I think are worthy of further investigations, especially because these aspects of well-being we're talking about they're seen as motivational mechanisms. So they have this evolutionary function in terms of encouraging striving and enhanced goal achievement, but also they're core components of good mental health. So if you think about the sort of a very depressed person is going to be very low in optimism and low in sort of sense of purpose. And there's kind of this global public health crisis at the moment in terms of depression. I mean, it's one of the most significant public health problems in the world. And this is one way of addressing that problem. So we hope that there will be some applied value eventually. Once these are just initial studies, we haven't established causation, and so there's a lot of work to be done, but we can imagine down the road that there could be, I think, some significant applied value as well.
Great. So, Michael, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks, Ricardo. It's great to be here. Thanks again for inviting me, and thanks for your awesome podcast. It's a really unique and I think a great public service. So thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.